I'm a beloved public figure who is often mobbed by members of the general public. I know what it's like to need a little bit of protection from time to time, and thus completely relate to certain sports entertainers who enlist the services of a heavy. The wrestling bodyguard hasn't been in vogue in WWE for a good while now, but there have been some great ones over the years, and it has proven to be a launching pad for many future superstars. For example, the following 10 badass lads and lass. I'm Adam Pachisi from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are the 10 best WWE bodyguards. Join us. Number 10, Tyson Tomko. Well, just look at this big, bald, jacked up muscle man, fresh off of the Ruthless Aggression Creator-Wrestler conveyor belts. What the hell are we gonna do with this beefcake? Featuring many of the qualities that Vince McMahon looks for in his would-be superstars, especially back then, Tyson Tomko was far from a world beater in the ring, but his look alone guaranteed he was going to get a shot to do something. And pairing him up with Christian and Trish Stratus as the evil couple's problem solver was probably the best use of him, as he got to look imposing and impressive while doing their dirty work, while being given a ringside seat to observe the work of two of the best in the business at that time. Tomko mainly stuck to being the silent observer cum ass kicker, keeping his mouth shut before running interference with power moves like crushing clotheslines and big boots when the time called for it. But he did occasionally get to display his comedic talents by playing off the often wound up Captain Charisma. For the year or so he was matched up with Christian, the highlight was probably their blunt exchange in a backstage segment at the 2005 Royal Rumble. Tomko, give me a beat. No. The big fella genuinely added to Christian's act and vice versa, and Tomko struggled to keep the momentum when they split. Number 9, Batista. When Batista was learning the ropes down in WWE developmental territory, Ohio Valley Wrestling, OVW booker and wrestling Nostradamus Jim Cornette predicted that the man who plied his trade as Leviathan would sooner than later headline WrestleMania. Big Dave would get there eventually, of course, but his introduction on WWE television and early role didn't exactly suggest WWE had the grandest hopes for him. Enlisted as the muscle of the crooked Reverend Devon, Deacon Batista basically had to stand there and guard the Rev's collection box, which was secured around his neck by a large chain. It didn't scream WrestleMania main eventer by any means, but it was a start and Batista did it well. He looked imposing, even if they did criminally cover up all of those beautiful muscles by putting him in a suit, and even though he only had one or two things to do on any given show, he typically did them well. Devon and Batista weren't pushed too strongly as an act, and it didn't take long for the animal to start arguing with his bent boss, eventually leading to a breakup and match between the pair, which Batista won. After that, the animal was traded to Raw and joined up with Evolution, and though he wasn't a bodyguard per se, he was certainly an enforcer type in a similar vein. Number 8, J&J Security. While most wrestling bodyguards tend to be a fair bit larger than the body they're protecting, there are exceptions to the rule, with J&J Security being the most notable example. Former WWE stars who were then working backstage as producers and trainers, Jamie by God Noble and Joey, the other one from M&M Mercury, got an on-screen gig as the punching bags for the Authority's Seth Rollins. The unit worked because they could both use their strength in numbers in attack and also justifiably get their behinds handed to them, which happened often. Noted solid workers in their own right, Mercury and Noble competed in multi-man matches as part of the job too, teaming up with the Architect in what were often TV main events. They looked good out there and helped to enhance Rollins, who was either WWE champion or otherwise firmly in the mix as a top contender. J&J were at their best when they were being thrown around, however, which was perfectly demonstrated when they got on the wrong side of Brock Lesnar, who took not just them but their new Cadillac apart. The bodyguard function eventually ran its course, and J&J were written out of storylines, but they were good value while they were around. Number 7, Sid. Possessor of one of the most incredible looks in wrestling history, Sid was practically tailor-made for the bodyguard role. Never one of the great workers, though much better than people tend to give him credit for, and flaky at the best of times, aka softball season, Sid was never positioned as the top guy for long and invariably found his way out of WWE or WCW after relatively short spells. Sid's 1995 run as the the bodyguard for Shawn Michaels was a masterstroke, as he backed up the Heartbreak Kid in his pursuit of the WWE title, which belonged to his old running buddy Diesel. The master and ruler of the world was a menacing presence at ringside, and most figured he would aid HBK in his big title showdown at WrestleMania 11. It wasn't to be, however, as Sid accidentally cost his employer the bout, their relationship ending the next night on Raw when Sid powerbombed Michaels over and over again. He soon accepted another payday from the $1 Million Corporation before he himself went into battle with Big Daddy Cool. Following a loss to Michaels, Sid disappeared again for a while, and when he came back, it was to act alone and go for the WWE title. Sid as the burly backup was a textbook case of hiding weakness and highlighting positives. Number 6, Big Boss Man. Ray Traylor first made his name in the professional wrestling industry in Jim Crockett Promotions as silent bodyguard Big Bubba Rogers, protecting Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express. He would go on to establish himself as a single star in his own right, gaining a reputation as one of the best bumping big men in the business for his work in WWE and WCW. When he returned to WWE in 1998 with a lot more miles on his body, he did so by going back to his roots as the bodyguard for Vince McMahon and the corporation. It was a high-profile role for the man from Cobb County, Georgia, and he looked more than credible in it. It did help that he changed up his look to SWAT-style gear as opposed to his old prison uniform, and that the top stars were all willing to sell for him. He captured the tag team and hardcore titles and was on such a roll that he met The Undertaker in a Hell in a Cell match at WrestleMania 15. That did not end well for him, and the year got crazier from there as he became a dog-murdering, funeral-crashing psychopath. But for those first few months when he was riding high with the chairman and his entourage, he proved his worth as a pivotal part of the show and a damn fine bodyguard. Number 5, Bob Orton Jr. A lot of times, heels will need bodyguards because they are too cowardly to fight their own battles. However, that wasn't the case with Roddy Piper, who enlisted the services of Bob Orton Jr. because he had so much heat that he oftentimes needed a little insurance policy in case things boiled over and the fans became as rowdy as he was. Orton was an accomplished second-generation star with a perennially broken arm who could more than take care of himself in ugly situations. The Cowboy had the good fortune of being paired up with Piper around the time of the very first WrestleMania, meaning that he was involved in the main event of the inaugural showcase of the Immortals, rubbing shoulders with Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. Piper and Orton's partnership worked very well, no doubt helped by the fact that they were genuinely close friends away from the ring too. The chemistry was on display for all to see. When Roddy left the company, Orton began working as the bodyguard of Adrian Adonis, leading to a bitter feud with Piper when Hot Rod eventually returned. Underrated then and now, Bob Orton Jr. was both a hell of a worker and an excellent heavy for the Wild Scotsman. Number 4, Virgil. Though often referred to as Ted DiBiase's servant, Virgil was initially brought in as the $1 Million Man's bodyguard. Virgil, the name and inside rib on the competition's Virgil Dusty Rhodes Runnels, carried around Ted's big fat wads of cash and would be on hand to punk out those who would do demeaning tasks in order to get their hands on some of the green stuff. He was also typically around to take a hiding from a fired-up babyface whenever DiBiase would flee the scene. Virgil would often be sent into battle to soften up a Jake Roberts or Randy Savage, though it never went as planned for the heels. After a long time playing the lackey and increasingly fed up with his frequent humiliations, Virgil finally stood up for himself and turned on his employer, which led to a babyface run and a series of matches between the two. Sadly for Virgil, the emancipation didn't lead to any sort of prolonged singles success, and he was so well defined in his previous role that he found it hard to shake the stigma. He showed up as head of security Vincent, another inside rib on Guess Who for the New World Order in WCW, before eventually coming back to WWE for a brief storyline with Ted DiBiase's namesake offspring. Number 3, the APA. There have been countless instances of WWE taking two talented performers who are doing nothing, teaming them up and hoping for the best. It doesn't always work, sure, but when it does, it can be magical. Fortunately for Ron Simmons and Bradshaw, they swam instead of sinking, first as the Acolytes as members of the Undertaker's nefarious Ministry of Darkness, and then as the Acolyte Protection Agency. Though while they were aligned with the Dead Man, they were good value, winning a couple of tag team championships championships and having a series of decent brawls with teams such as the Hardys and the Dudleys, it was when they transitioned into hired muscle and crucially were allowed to replicate their backstage personas on camera that the two really took off. The APA were formed in early 2000 and didn't care whether they were protecting a babyface or a heel, so long as they got paid and were allowed to drink beer and play cards in their makeshift office. When their pounding music hit, you knew it was on and that somebody was more than likely going to get their head kicked in. And that's because APA stood for Acolyte Protection Agency, but also always pounding ass too. Number 2, Chyna. Before Joni Laura came along, if a female performer accompanied a male to ringside, it was almost exclusively to act as their valet. While sensational Sherry Martel was unafraid to get physical with the guys and took some outrageous bumps for her clients, Chyna took things to another level when she burst onto the scene in 1997, displaying an unmatched physicality and possessing a physique that matches many of the men. Not long after debuting as a planted fan in the crowd, she was properly established as the bodyguard of D-Generation X. This was something that some members of the roster had a hard time coming to terms with, as they were not used to selling offense from a woman. Chyna, though, made it easy because she had the size and presence to make it believable, and she acted well as the stoic counter to Hunter and Sean's frat boy theatrics. Chyna's popularity grew and grew over the following months and years to the point that she became a 2-time Intercontinental Champion and was once considered for a run with the WWE title. Not too shabby for an originally limited Killer Kowalski graduate with an undeniably unique look. Chyna was a trailblazer in the industry, and it all started with her time as a bodyguard, a job she did as well as anyone with balls. Number 1, Diesel. Start your engines and honk your horns because it's time to take a look at Big Daddy Cool himself. Kevin Nash had been criminally misused in WCW, going from Master Blaster to Oz to Vinny Vegas. 3 naff gimmicks that did the Giant no favors whatsoever. Shawn Michaels was a fan of the wisecracking Vegas, however, and implored Vince McMahon to give him a shot. The Heartbreak Kid was on the rise as a single star and felt that having a heavy in his corner would help add to his presentation. And he was right. From the moment they appeared together on screen, the pairing clicked, with both performers continuing to grow and flourish together. Decked out in black leather and opting to do his talking with his fists, Diesel was undeniably cool and was a nice counterbalance to the flamboyant and cocky HBK. It was hardly surprising then when Diesel started getting more and more popular, eventually outgrowing his fellow dude with attitude as fans embraced him as a would-be hero. The split happened at the 1994 Survivor Series, and just a few days later, Big Sexy beat Bob Backlund to win the WWE title at a Madison Square Garden house show in front of 40,000 fans. I mean, the Garden doesn't actually hold 40,000 fans, but by God, it did that night.